Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? What is this strange thing, this strange idea, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to? Lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, mind spinning and emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Sleepy Time Tales is intended to be used as a distraction to what keeps you awake at night, or maybe sometimes background noise or company. As far as I know, there are a couple of different ways to engage with the show. The main idea is that it gives you something to focus on, a story or an event that lets you keep your mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxieties, to help you to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep. But maybe you need something a bit different. Maybe you just need some background noise. Some people like white noise generators, or the sound of the ocean, or the wind in the trees, or the waves on the shore, or some boring dude just droning on in the background. What counts as you're listening, though, is that you don't try to force the sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the thread of the story and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, I'm hoping you're asleep before we get to the end of the episode. But it's important that you don't feel pressurized. If this is your first night with us, this actually probably won't work for you. It'll probably take a solid 3 nights or so for you to get used to it, to get used to my voice. Maybe my accent is strange. Maybe the idea of listening to someone talk to you while you're asleep is a bit odd. Or maybe one episode just isn't long enough. Or maybe you don't actually struggle to go to sleep. Maybe you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night. What I recommend in that case is to let the podcast run all night. Download a bunch of episodes, put them in a playlist, and let them go. That way, if you wake up in the middle of the night, you can just carry on listening and go back to sleep again. And you can even do the same thing if you wake up before your alarm. Some people wake up 30 minutes or 60 minutes before their alarm and they really struggle. And you can carry on listening and go back to sleep again. And you may wonder what the point of that is. But I've had people actually thank me for suggesting this, because there is something about allowing yourself complete relaxation right before the alarm that's satisfying on a whole new level. So listen and try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this may seem strange to you, so give it a chance. Because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. Before we get on with the show, I'd like to ask for a couple of minutes of your time. If you've been listening to Sleepy Time Tales for a while and you're finding that it helps you to sleep, and you'd like to help me keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, please consider supporting me on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that helps me keep the lights on and gets you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. Go across there, take a look at what you can get for as little as $2 a month, and sign up to help me keep this show going. And if monthly is a big ask, of course there's the option of just throwing a little something in the tip jar if you've got some money available. That is up on the website. You can just click through from there. A reminder as well that I've been taking up podcast editing. Business is going quite well, and things are picking up for me quite nicely, which is cool. But I would love to be able to help any Sleepy Time Tales listeners out who are currently podcasting and needing some help, or would like to start a podcast and just don't know where to begin, or don't have the time to do all the fiddly administrative stuff. I'm doing that for a lot of people at the moment, and they're finding it very useful. Busy professionals often don't have time for all the various jumping through hoops you need to do. And I think that's enough of that for tonight. Let's get back to the show. Thank you for your time. This week, we're reading Night and Day by Virginia Woolf. Chapter 1. It was a Sunday evening in October, and in common with many other ladies of her class, Catherine Hilbery was pouring out tea. Perhaps a fifth part of her mind was thus occupied, and the remaining parts leapt over the little barrier of the day which interposed between Monday morning and this rather subdued moment, and played with the things one does voluntarily and normally in the daylight. But although she was silent, she was evidently mistress of a situation which was familiar enough to her, and inclined to let it take its way for the 600th time, perhaps, without bringing into play any of her unoccupied faculties. A single glance was enough to show that Mrs. Hilbery was so rich in the gifts which make tea parties of elderly, distinguished people successful, that she scarcely needed any help from her daughter, provided that the tiresome business of teacups and bread and butter was discharged for her. Considering that the little party had been seated around the tea table for less than 20 minutes, the animation observable on their faces, and the amount of sound they were producing collectively, were very creditable to the hostess. It suddenly came into Catherine's mind that if someone opened the door at this moment, he would think they were enjoying themselves. He would think, what an extremely nice house to come into. And instinctively she laughed, and said something to increase the noise, for the credit of the house presumably, since she herself had not been feeling exhilarated. At the very same moment, rather to her amusement, the door was flung open, and a young man entered the room. Catherine, as she shook hands with him, asked him in her own mind, "Now, do you think we're enjoying ourselves enormously?" "Mr. Denham, mother," she said aloud, for she saw that her mother had forgotten his name. That fact was perceptible to Mr. Denham also, and increased the awkwardness which inevitably attends the entrance of a stranger into a room full of people much at their ease, and all launched upon sentences. At the same time, it seemed to Mr. Denham as if 1,000 softly padded doors had closed between him and the street outside. A fine mist, the etherealized essence of the fog, hung visibly in the wide and rather empty space of the drawing-room. All silver where the candles were grouped on the tea table, and ruddy again in the firelight. With the omnibuses and cabs still running in his head, and his body still tingling with his quick walk along the streets in and out of traffic and foot passengers, this drawing-room seemed very remote and still. And the faces of the elderly people were mellowed, at some distance from each other, and had a bloom on them, owing to the fact that the air in the drawing-room was thickened by blue grains of mist. Mr. Denham had come in as Mr. Fortescue, the eminent novelist, reached the middle of a very long sentence. He kept this suspended while the newcomer sat down, and Mrs. Hilbery deftly joined the severed parts by leaning towards him and remarking, "Now what would you do if you were married to an engineer and had to live in Manchester, Mr. Denham?" "Surely she could learn Persian," broke in a thin elderly gentleman. "Is there no retired schoolmaster or man of letters in Manchester with whom she could read Persian?" "A cousin of ours has married and gone to live in Manchester," Catherine explained. Mr. Denham muttered something, which was indeed all that was required of him, and the novelist went on where he had left off. Privately, Mr. Denham cursed himself very sharply for having exchanged the freedom of the street for this sophisticated drawing-room, where among other disagreeables he certainly would not appear at his best. He glanced around him, and saw that, save for Catherine, they were all over 40. The only consolation being that Mr. Fortescue was a considerable celebrity, so that tomorrow one might be glad to have met him. "Have you ever been to Manchester?" he asked Catherine. "Never," she replied. "Why do you object to it, then?" Catherine stirred her tea and seemed to speculate, so Denham thought upon the duty of filling someone else's cup. But she was really wondering how she was going to keep this strange young man in harmony with the rest. She observed that he was compressing his teacup, so that there was danger lest the thin china might cave inwards. She could see that he was nervous. One would expect a bony young man with his face slightly reddened by the wind, and his hair not altogether smooth, to be nervous in such a party. Further, he probably disliked this kind of thing, and had come out of curiosity, or because her father had invited him. Anyhow, he would not be easily combined with the rest. "I should think there would be no one to talk to in Manchester," she replied at random. Mr. Fortescue had been observing her for a moment or two, as novelists are inclined to observe, and at this remark he smiled, and made it the text for a little further speculation. In spite of a slight tendency to exaggeration, Catherine decidedly hits the mark, he said. And lying back in his chair, with his opaque, contemplative eyes fixed on the ceiling, and the tips of his fingers pressed together, he depicted first the horrors of the streets of Manchester, and then the bare, immense moors on the outskirts of town, and then the scrubby little house in which the girl would live, and then the professors and the miserable young students devoted to the more strenuous works of our younger dramatists who would visit her, and how her appearance would change by degree, and how she would fly to London, and how Catherine would have to lead her about, as one leads an eager dog on a chain, past rows of clamorous butchers' shops, poor dear creature. "Oh, Mr. Fortescue," exclaimed Mrs. Hilbery as he finished. "I had just written to say how I envied her. I was thinking of the big gardens and the dear old ladies in mittens, who read nothing but the Spectator, and snuff the candles." "Have they all disappeared?" I told her she would find the nice things of London without the horrid streets that depress one so. "There is the university," said the thin gentleman, who had previously insisted upon the existence of people knowing Persian. "I know there are Moors there, because I read about them in a book the other day," said Catherine. I am grieved and amazed at the ignorance of my family, Mr. Hilbery remarked. He was an elderly man, with a pair of oval hazel eyes, which were rather bright for his time of life, and relieved the heaviness of his face. He played constantly with a little green stone attached to his watch chain, thus displaying long and very sensitive fingers, and had a habit of moving his head hither and thither very quickly, without altering the position of his large and rather corpulent body, so that he seemed to be providing himself incessantly with food for amusement and reflection, with the least possible expenditure of energy. One might suppose that he had passed the time of life when his ambitions were personal, or that he had gratified them as far as he was likely to do, and now employed his considerable acuteness rather to observe and reflect than to attain any result. Catherine, so Denham decided, while Mr. Fortescue built up another rounded structure of words, had a likeness to each of her parents. But these elements were rather oddly blended. She had the quick impulsive movements of her mother, the lips parting often to speak and closing again, and the dark oval eyes of her father brimming with light upon a basis of sadness, or since she was too young to have acquired a sorrowful point of view, one might say that the basis was not sadness, so much as a spirit given to contemplation and self-control. Judging by her hair, her colouring, and the shape of her features, she was striking, if not actually beautiful. Decision and composure stamped her, a combination of qualities that produced a very marked character, and one that was not calculated to put a young man, who scarcely knew her, at his ease. For the rest, she was tall. Her dress was of some quiet colour, with old yellow-tinted lace for ornament, to which the spark of an ancient jewel gave it one red gleam. Denham noticed that, although silent, she kept sufficient control of the situation to answer immediately her mother appealed to her for help. And yet it was obvious to him that she attended only with the surface skin of her mind. It struck him that her position at the tea-table, among all these elderly people, was not without its difficulties, and he checked his inclination to find her, or her attitude, generally antipathetic to him. The talk had passed over Manchester, after dealing with it very generously. Would it be the Battle of Trafalgar or the Spanish Armada, Catherine? Her mother demanded. Trafalgar, mother. Trafalgar, of course. How stupid of me. Another cup of tea with a thin slice of lemon in it. And then, dear Mr. Fortescue, please explain my absurd little puzzle. One can't help believing gentlemen with Roman noses, even if one meets them in omnibuses. Mr. Hilbery here interposed so far as Denham was concerned, and talked a great deal of sense about the solicitor's profession, and the changes which he had seen in his lifetime. Indeed, Denham properly fell to his lot, owing to the fact that an article by Denham upon some legal matter, published by Mr. Hilbery in his review, had brought them acquainted. But when a moment later Mrs. Sutton Bailey was announced, he turned to her, and Mr. Denham found himself sitting silent, rejecting possible things to say, beside Catherine, who was silent too. Being much about the same age and both under 30, they were prohibited from the use of a great many convenient phrases, which launched conversation into smooth waters. They were further silenced by Catherine's rather malicious determination not to help this young man, in whose upright and resolute bearing she detected something hostile to her surroundings by any of the usual feminine amenities. They therefore sat silent, Denham controlling his desire to say something abrupt and explosive, which should shock her into life. But Mrs. Hilbery was immediately sensitive to any silence in the drawing-room, as of a dumb note in a sonorous scale, and leaning across the table, she observed, in the curiously tentative, detached manner which always gave her phrases the likeness of butterflies, flaunting from one sunny spot to another. "Do you know, Mr. Denham, you remind me so much of dear Mr. Ruskin. Is it his tie, Catherine, or his hair, or the way he sits in his chair? Do tell me, Mr. Denham, are you an admirer of Ruskin? Someone the other day said to me, 'Oh no, we don't read Ruskin, Mrs. Hilbery.' What do you read, I wonder? For you can't spend all your time going up in aeroplanes and burrowing into the bowels of the earth." She looked benevolently at Denham, who said nothing articulate, and then at Catherine, who smiled but said nothing either, upon which Mrs. Hilbery seemed possessed by a brilliant idea and exclaimed, "I'm sure Mr. Denham would like to see our things, Catherine. I'm sure he's not like that dreadful young man, Mr. Ponting, who told me that he considered it our duty to live exclusively in the present. After all, what is the present? Half of it's the past, and the better half too, I should say," she added, turning to Mr. Fortescue. Denham rose, half meaning to go, and thinking that he had seen all that there was to see. But Catherine rose at the same moment, and saying, "Perhaps you would like to see the pictures," led the way across the drawing-room to a smaller room opening out of it. The smaller room was something like a chapel in a cathedral, or a grotto in a cave, for the booming sound of the traffic in the distance suggested the soft surge of waters, and the oval mirrors, with their silver surface, were like deep pools trembling beneath starlight. But the comparison to a religious temple of some kind was the more apt of the two, for the little room was crowded with relics. As Catherine touched different spots, light sprang here and there, and revealed a square mass of red and gold books, and then a long skirt in blue and white paint lustrous behind glass, and then a mahogany writing table with its orderly equipment, and finally a picture above the table, to which special illumination was accorded. When Catherine had touched these last lights, she stood back, as much as to say, "There." Denham found himself looked down upon by the eyes of the great poet, Richard Allardyce, and suffered a little shock which would have led him, had he been wearing a hat, to remove it. The eyes looked at him out of the mellow pinks and yellows of the paint, divine friendliness, which embraced him and passed on to contemplate the entire world. The paint had so faded that very little but the beautiful large eyes were left, dark in the surrounding dimness. Catherine waited as though for him to receive a full impression, and then she said, "This is his writing table. He used this pen." And she lifted a quill pen and laid it down again. The writing table was splashed with old ink, and the pen dishevelled in service. There lay the gigantic gold-rimmed spectacles, ready to hand, and beneath the table was a pair of large worn slippers, one of which Catherine picked up, remarking, "I think my grandfather must have been at least twice as large as anyone is nowadays." "This," she went on, as if she knew what she had to say by heart, "is the original manuscript of the Ode to Winter. The early poems are far less corrected than the latter. Would you like to look at it? While Mr. Denham examined the manuscript, she glanced up at her grandfather, and for the 1000th time fell into a pleasant, dreamy state in which she seemed to be the companion of those giant men, of their own lineage at any rate, and the insignificant present moment was put to shame. The magnificent ghostly head on the canvas surely never beheld all the trivialities of a Sunday afternoon, and it did not seem to matter what she and this young man said to each other, for they were only small people. This is a copy of the first edition of the poems, she continued, without considering the fact that Mr. Denham was still occupied with the manuscript, which contains several poems that have not been reprinted, as well as corrections. She paused for a minute and then went on, as if these spaces had all been calculated. That lady in blue is my great-grandmother by Millington. Here is my uncle's walking stick. He was Sir Richard Warburton, you know, and rode with Havelock to the relief of Lucknow. And then, let me see. Oh, that's the original Allardyce, 1697. The founder of the family fortunes, with his wife. Someone gave us this bowl the other day because it has their crest and initials. We think it must have been given to them to celebrate their silver wedding day. Here she stopped for a moment, wondering why it was that Mr. Denham said nothing. Her feeling that he was antagonistic to her, which had lapsed while she thought of her family possessions, returned so keenly that she stopped in the middle of her catalogue and looked at him. Her mother, wishing to connect him reputably with the great dead, had compared him with Mr. Ruskin, and the comparison was in Catherine's mind, and led her to be more critical of the young man than was fair. For a young man paying a call in a tailcoat is in a different element altogether, from a head seized at its climax of expressiveness, gazing immutably from behind a sheet of glass, which was all that remained to her of Mr. Ruskin. He had a singular face, a face built for swiftness and decision, rather than for massive contemplation. The forehead broad, the nose long and formidable, the lips clean-shaven, and at once dogged and sensitive, the cheeks lean, with a deeply running tide of red blood in them. His eyes, expressive now of the usual masculine impersonality and authority, might reveal more subtle emotions under favourite circumstances, for they were large, and of a clear brown colour. He seemed unexpectedly to hesitate and speculate. But Catherine only looked at him to wonder whether his face would not have come nearer the standard of her dead heroes if it had been adorned with side whiskers. In his spare build and thin, though healthy cheeks, she saw tokens of an angular and acrid soul. His voice, she noticed, had a slight vibrating or creaking sound in it, and Elise laid down the manuscript and said, "You must be very proud of your family, Miss Hilbery." "Yes, I am," Catherine answered, and she added, "Do you think there's anything wrong with that?" "Wrong? How could it be wrong?" "It must be a bore, though, showing your things to visitors," he added reflectively. "Not if the visitors like them." "Isn't it difficult to live up to your ancestors?" he proceeded. "I dare say I shouldn't try to write poetry," Catherine replied. "No, and that's what I should hate. I don't bear my grandfather to cut me out." And after all, Denham went on, glancing around him satirically, as Catherine thought, It's not your grandfather's only. You're cut out all the way round. I suppose you come from one of the most distinguished families in England. They're the Warburtons and the Mannings, and you're related to the Otways, aren't you? I read it all in some magazine, he added. The Otways are my cousins, Catherine replied. Well, said Denham in a final tone of voice, as if his argument was proved. Well, said Catherine, I don't see that you've proved anything. Denham smiled, in a peculiarly provoking way. He was amused and gratified to find that he had the power to annoy his oblivious, supercilious hostess, if he could not impress her, though he would have preferred to impress her. He sat silent, holding the precious little book of poems unopened in his hands, and Catherine watched him, the melancholy or contemplative expression deepening in her eyes as her annoyance faded. She appeared to be considering many things. She had forgotten her duties. Well, said Denham again, suddenly opening the little book of poems, as though he had said all that he had meant to say, or could with propriety say. He turned over the pages with great decision, as if he were judging the book in its entirety, the printing and paper and binding, as well as the poetry, and then, having satisfied himself of its good or bad quality, he placed it on the writing table, and examined the malacca cane with the gold knob which had belonged to the soldier. But aren't you proud of your family? Catherine demanded. No, said Denham. We've never done anything to be proud of, unless you count paying one's bills a matter for pride. That sounds rather dull, Catherine remarked. You would think us horribly dull, Denham agreed. Yes, I might find you dull, but I don't think I should find you ridiculous, Catherine added, as if Denham had actually brought that charge against her family. No, because we're not in the least ridiculous. We're a respectable middle-class family living at Highgate. We don't live at Highgate, but we're middle-class too, I suppose. Denham merely smiled, and replacing the malacca cane on the rack, he drew a sword from its ornamental sheath. That belongs to Clive, so we say, said Catherine, taking up her duties as hostess again automatically. Is it a lie? Denham inquired. It's a family tradition. I don't know that we can prove it. You see, we don't have any traditions in our family, said Denham. You sound very dull, Catherine remarked for the second time. Merely middle class, Denham replied. You pay your bills and you speak the truth. I don't see why you should despise us. Mr. Denham carefully sheathed the sword which the Hilberys said belonged to Clive. I shouldn't like to be you, that's all I said, he replied, as if he were saying what he thought as accurately as he could. No, but one never would like to be anyone else. I should. I should like to be lots of other people. Then why not us? Catherine asked. Denham looked at her as she sat in her grandfather's armchair, drawing her great-uncle's malacca cane smoothly through her fingers, while her background was made up equally of lustrous blue and white paint, and crimson books with gilt lines on them. The vitality and composure of her attitude, as of a bright-plumed bird poised easily before further flights, roused him to show her the limitations of her lot. So soon, so easily would he be forgotten. You'll never know anything at first hand, he began, almost savagely. It's all been done for you. You'll never know the pleasure of buying things after saving up for them, or reading books for the first time, or making discoveries. Go on, Catherine observed, as he paused, suddenly doubtful, when he heard his voice proclaiming aloud these facts, whether there was any truth in them. Of course, I don't know how you spend your time, he continued, a little stiffly. But I suppose you have to show people around. You're writing a life of your grandfather, aren't you? And this kind of thing, he nodded towards the other room, where they could hear bursts of cultivated laughter, must take up a lot of time. She looked at him expectantly, as if between them they were decorating a small figure of herself, and she saw him hesitating in the disposition of some bow or sash. You've got it very nearly right, she said, but I only help my mother. I don't write myself. Do you do anything yourself? He demanded. What do you mean? She asked. I don't leave the house at 10 and come back at 6. I don't mean that. Mr. Denham had recovered his self-control. He spoke with a quietness which made Catherine rather anxious that he should explain himself. But at the same time she wished to annoy him, to waft him away from her on some light current of ridicule or satire, as she was wont to do with these intermittent young men of her father's. Nobody ever does do anything worth doing nowadays, she remarked. You see, she tapped the volume of her grandfather's poems. We don't even print as well as they did. And as for poets or painters or novelists, there are none. So at any rate, I'm not singular. No, we haven't any great men, Denham replied. I'm very glad that we haven't. I hate great men. The worship of greatness in the 19th century seems to me to explain the worthlessness of that generation. Catherine opened her lips and drew in her breath, as if to reply with equal vigour, when the shutting of a door in the next room withdrew her attention, and they both became conscious that the voices, which had been rising and falling round the tea table, had fallen silent. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales. Even seemed to have sunk lower. A podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. A moment later, Mrs. Hilbery appeared. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh. She looked at them with a smile of expectancy on her face. But make sure to follow or subscribe to scenes from the drama of the younger generation. New episodes being played for her benefit. Good night, and sweet dreams. She was a remarkable-looking woman. Well advanced in the 60s, but owing to the lightness of her frame and the brightness of her eyes, she seemed to have been wafted over the surface of the years without taking much harm in the passage. Her face was shrunken and aquiline, but any hint of sharpness was dispelled by the large blue eyes, at once sagacious and innocent, which seemed to regard the world with an enormous desire that it should behave itself nobly, in an entire confidence that it could do so if it would only take the pains. And I'm going to leave it there. So far, I'm rather liking this, so I think we're going to pick up here again fairly soon. And if you'd like to carry on in the meantime, as always, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes.